There's a few videos I want to upload tonight, then I'll give it a bit of a rest. In fact, bear with me 1 second, I'm just going to change the seat. Okay, so the first video I want to talk about is the latest developments in Ukraine. I've been keeping a little bit of a online log, I guess you could call it, about this situation from pretty much near the start. And the reason I've been doing that is because I find with a lot of conflicts there's not always a great deal of retrospective reflection on why the conflict came about in the first place. Now, I won't deny I'm biased on this. I have opinions on it. I'm not 50-50. I am biased. I'm going to say that up front, in the sense that I am more sympathetic to one side. But first of all, just the latest developments is that there's been high-level diplomatic talks today, 6 hours, in Geneva, I believe. Sergei Lavrov, John Kerry, Catherine Ashton, and other top-level diplomats over the crisis on the ground. I was watching a documentary a few nights ago, a pretty balanced documentary, I have to say, on the Balkan Wars. And I say balanced because it was interviewing a lot of people. It interviewed Milosevic, it interviewed people on the other side, so it did come across as balanced in that sense. But I did see some sinister echoes of what happened there and what's happening here. As with that situation, we saw some green offshoots, green shoots of hope in those early years, and yet that turned into a terrible conflict, especially in Bosnia. Croatia was pretty awful as well. But what happened is, after the crisis in Slovenia, the so-called 10-day war, there was a period of relative peace, and there was a lot of high-level talks. Now, there's a risk here that people could be complacent and think, oh well, it's over now. So I don't want to say that. The reporter did make a good point. I forget which network I was watching, but the reporter did mention that, I think it was Al Jazeera actually, he said, you know, this is what diplomats do. They come out of meetings and they hardly ever say something negative. They'll always put some positive spin on it. Apparently all sides have agreed that the key must be on Ukraine's future de-escalation. That's great. Now, from my perspective, a lot relies on the Russian response, because the main nationalism at the moment seems to be coming from the Russian side. This uprising in eastern Ukraine was by Russian neo-nationalists. Now, you cannot talk about democracy and getting a referendum when there's violence on the ground. That's just inconsistent. Here in the UK, the people of Scotland are going to have a referendum in September. There's a debate to be had, they're having a referendum, and so far it's been peaceful. I hope it stays that way. I have my position, I'm a unionist, but it's peaceful. So for Russia to basically condone the violence from their side and say, oh well, it's the interest of democracy, it's in the interest of self-determination, whilst doing nothing about the violence from the Russian side, seems quite not a good position to hold, as far as I'm concerned. Russia has enormous influence on the region and always will do. From that point of view, it seems to me that something pragmatic that Putin can do is fly in, with the permission of the Ukrainians, because let's not forget this is still Ukraine, with their permission, fly in and negotiate with these people who are rising up against Kiev's rule. Kiev, as far as I'm concerned, I would agree with John Kerry. They're showing massive restraint and patience, so much so their own side has called them weak on the issue. But I think a huge amount of credit has to go to the government in Kiev for dealing with both Crimea and this situation with the sort of patience that they've shown. Most other countries in the world, if they are facing an insurrection or an invasion, or a large part of their country has been annexed, would respond with brute force. Ukraine has finally sent in the military, but that they're only doing what any other country in the world would do, and they're only doing what Russia done in Chechnya. So that's why the Russian hypocrisy here is astounding. You know, Russia argues it's putting down an uprising in Chechnya, Dagestan and so on. The Ukrainians can argue exactly the same thing, and there's been, by the looks of it, much fewer fatalities. So I do think a large part of this lies in Russia. It may be that the people on the ground are ethnic Russians who are Ukrainians, but reports have suggested that Russian troops are on the ground, or at least people in Russian uniforms. If that's the case, that's disgraceful, because that is an example of Russia clearly stirring things up on the ground. You know, does anyone really believe Lavrov when he says that they're not interfering in Ukraine's internal affairs? Come on. It doesn't matter what side you're on, that is just stating, that is so obvious that Russia is getting involved in Ukraine's internal affairs. Of course I would turn around and say it's the EU and the US that are meddling in it, but it isn't the EU and the US that has troops massed along the border, is it? And there's certainly no EU troops on the ground, so that's just a fact. I think a lot of this now does lie on the Russian side to de-escalate it, because the way I've seen it, Putin has been fear-mongering. He's been talking about how these people need protection. He's been stirring up this dragon, this sort of shadow of a fascist force in Ukraine. What I would argue is, yes, there is fascist elements there. I acknowledge that. By the way, one part of this negotiation is an absolute zero tolerance to racism or discrimination against any group, so that will protect the Russian speakers. But what is Putin going to do to ensure that the Russian side in Ukraine are not stirred up by his sort of rhetoric? Because there's been plenty of examples here. I understand people suffered on both sides, but a lot of the aggression has been from the Russian side. Look at the Crimea referendum. Ukrainians were basically silenced. Those who were pro-Ukraine were basically silenced. Their TV stations were smashed up. They were physically threatened. How can that have been a fair referendum? I think it's just phony to call it that. You know, Putin can't trump democracy under those circumstances. It was not a fair referendum. Even if the majority of people there do want to be Russian, the fact remains it wasn't a fair referendum. You know, okay, have a peaceful referendum, then make that choice. But under those circumstances, I don't think it was a legitimate referendum in those circumstances. What else can I say? I hope this is good news today. I hope it is a cause for optimism. John Kerry mentioned something about attacks on Jewish people and Jews given an ultimatum to leave. I don't know which side that's coming from, but whichever side it's coming from, it's just a disgrace. You know, in a country that's had the history Ukraine has had, it was basically the chessboard of 2 world wars. Ukraine's a country that's seen more war than many countries, and it doesn't need it again. Some of the bloodiest battles of World War II in the Eastern Front were fought on Ukrainian soil. Of course then it wasn't an independent country, but I mean then it was the Ukrainian region. My point is, Ukraine has seen enough war to last forever, so let's just hope this maybe is something positive. But I do think the brunt of responsibility lies here with Russia, because it is Russia that stirred up the situation. It is Russia that is the next Ukraine. It is Russia that has stirred up nationalism in the region by scaremongering over this threat, a threat that I believe has been hugely exaggerated. Don't forget, an independent UN report, not an American report, not a British report, an independent UN report found that whilst there had been some cases of discrimination against the Russian population, it was not systematic and it was not widespread. Certainly not enough to justify Putin's actions in the last few months. So that's all I can really say is about the situation now from an outside perspective. And one more point, let's not forget the people who were gunned down on the Maidan weren't Russian speakers. It's not like Yanukovych's forces targeted Russian speakers, which would have been an excuse that Putin would have come in to protect them. The majority of victims in Ukraine's political crisis over the last few months, from what I have seen, has been Ukrainians. I'm not saying the other side hasn't suffered, but certainly not to the sort of extent whereby we're not talking about ethnic cleansing of Russian speakers here. It's not like what's happening in, for example, the Central African Republic, where you have a side that is actually being ethnically cleansed. I believe a lot of this is fear-mongering from Moscow. I'm not saying there aren't legitimate issues to be had, and I'm sure that Ukraine didn't treat its Russian population perfectly. I'm not saying that it did, but certainly not enough to involve a power like Russia getting involved. So I'll just leave it there. I hope that this will be maybe tone the situation down, but I do believe Russia has a lot of responsibility here.